The Angel of Accomplishment, from Miss Bracegirdle and Others, by Stacy Aumonier. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michael Maggs. The Angel of Accomplishment. In reconstructing the sombre story which gathered around the professional association of those two clever men, James Ray and Francis Valery, it is necessary to know a little of their early life and upbringing. I am indebted very considerably to my friend Timothy Rallish for the light of his somewhat sardonic perceptions upon the character of Ray. They were at Marlborough together and afterwards at Oxford, though at different colleges, Timothy at Oriel and Ray, as one would naturally expect, at Balliol. "I used to like him," said Timothy. "I suppose I was the only chap who did. They hated him at Marlborough. He was so confoundedly pious. Up at Oxford it was not so bad. There are always such a lot of precious people at Balliol. It doesn't stand out so. He was an idealist, without a conscience, if you know what I mean. He set up impossible standards, never attempted to live up to them, or to observe whether anyone else attempted to. His contempt for his fellow creatures was almost abnormal. I think the whole attitude, in some queer way, came out of his music madness. Music was the absorbing passion of his life, and even for the best of that he never appeared to have a very great opinion. I believe he thought that Bach's compositions were not too bad, and for Beethoven he sometimes indulged in mild patronage. Schumann bored him, and so did Wagner, and as for Chopin's sentimental tripe, he had no use. I am talking now of Ray between the age of 17 and 23, the age when one's critical faculties are relentless, when one knows every darn thing, don't you know? I can't tell why I liked Ray. He did not, and never has, like me. Perhaps there was something about the profundity of his discontent which appealed to me, his restlessness and detachment. I like people who are dissatisfied, but there was more than that about him. He was a spiritual wanton. I believe he would have sacrificed a city full of babies to perfect one musical phrase. You see, there was no reason at all why he should have gone up to Oxford. He was only interested in music, which has never been properly taught there. I think he liked to compose tone poems in the society of rich men's sons who were only interested in sports and ragtime. The contact satisfied some cynical kink in his nature. It was certainly nothing to do with the medievalism of Oxford, which only bored him. Oh, Lord, the things which bored Jimmy Ray when he was 23. At that time, I asked, "Do you know anything about his standard of accomplishments?" "Very little," replied Timothy. "Of course, I know nothing about music myself, but people who did know something used to differ considerably about Ray. I got the general impression that he was talented in a nebulous kind of way, that he had ideas, but that they were too involved, that he could create atmosphere, but that he couldn't construct. He was a very pretty boy at that time, with a thin, aesthetic face, dark reflective eyes, and 2 pink spots in the centre of each cheek. He got out of all sports on the ground that he had a weak heart. It is certainly true that his father, who made a small fortune out of accordion-pleated skirts, died at an early age from heart disease. His mother was a gentle, negative kind of woman who lived at Bournemouth, knitted things for people, and distributed prizes at girls' friendly societies. He also had 2 sisters. One, I believe, dabbled in Christian Science, the other married a sanitary inspector. They played no great part in Ray's life. Neither did any of them, nor any relative or ancestor as far as I can find out, supply any note to account for the peculiarly individual precocity of James himself. Afterwards, when he became famous, the whole family was almost shocked. This conversation with Timothy impressed itself on my memory very vividly, for it occurred just after I had had an interview with Ray's mother. At that time the study and analysis of suppressions and complexes had not reached the degree of fashionable absurdity which it has at the present day, but neurosis has always been a popular complaint amongst those people unlucky enough to be able to indulge in it. As an ordinary, rather overworked local practitioner, I can only give my opinion that neurosis only exists amongst that small minority of people who do not have to fight for existence. It appears to me that this instinct for fighting for existence is born in every man or woman. When circumstances rob them of it, they are apt to raise some artificial standard and fight for that, for fight they must. We have not reached the millennium. During my 33 years of experience in the medical profession, I have never yet met the case of a man or woman who worked hard for a living being neurotic, unless his or her constitution was already undermined by neurotic parentage. You may say that an artificial standard is as good a thing to fight for as a real standard, and so it may be. A man who fights for some spiritual cause is certainly as justified as a man who fights to earn bread and wine. It is all a question of equipoise. But a man who in Timothy's terms would sacrifice a city full of babies to perfect one musical phrase is, in my opinion, a lunatic. But I am perfectly willing to admit that I may be wrong. For all I know, the whole social fabric may be changing its face values. We can only act according to our lights. When Ray's mother came and spoke to me about him, I knew nothing about the man. He was 31 then. I can see her now, that gentle old lady with silver curls and pleading eyes, extremely confiding and rather outraged. Such things didn't happen at Bournemouth. But, dear her, Jimmy had only been to Bournemouth once, and he refused to go again because the trams didn't run on Sundays, and it took him 2 hours to walk out of the town. Was ever such a ridiculous excuse offered? He was a dear boy, a lovable, clever, oh, brilliantly clever boy, but quite incomprehensible, and with such awful moods. Then, with great solemn shaking curls, bobbing above the stiff corsets, worse than that, a terrible temper, cruel, vindictive. He might do anything in such moods. She regarded me alertly. I think she thought I might prescribe some pills. They do that in Bournemouth. One to be taken night and morning will cure asthma, sluggish liver, or homicidal mania. I remarked obligingly that I would see the young man. But how was it to be done? He lived in Chelsea, a terrible irreligious suburb of London, inhabited by artists and others, quite irresponsible people. Besides, he was so exclusive, so apt to be rude, even violent and abusive. He detested strangers. He was altogether so unlike his dear papa, who treated everyone, even his work-people, as though they were equals. And then came the terrible crux of the story. It appeared that on Jimmy Ray's solitary visit to Bournemouth, he had murdered a cat. Not, mark you, an ordinary stray vagabond cat, but his mother's cat, his mother's own darling Pee-wee. The cat, it appeared, had annoyed him for several nights when he was sitting up late trying to compose. He had warned his mother that something would have to be done. He appeared haggard and distraught in the mornings. But Mrs. Ray had not taken the matter very seriously. Such a trivial affair. Dear Pee-wee, he was often like that. He made funny noises in the night. There were several cats in the neighbouring houses, doubtless friends of Pee-wee's. And then, one night, the appalling thing happened. Jimmy got up at about 1 o'clock. He went out and picked up a piece of plank. He beat the cat to a pulp. He had never been to Bournemouth since. What can you suggest, Dr. Parsons? I am quite sure that I should have suggested nothing, done nothing, had I not soon after come in touch with Timothy Rallish, who reported upon Ray in the manner I have stated. I was amused to hear Timothy say that he didn't know why he liked Ray. I knew the reason. It was because Timothy couldn't help liking everyone. He was that kind of boy, rather short and stocky, with ingenious blue eyes which sparkled at you through enormous gold-rimmed glasses. He found life absorbing. He had scrambled through Oxford, accomplishing nothing of note beyond making himself popular. His people were poor, and on coming down from Oxford he had plunged into the vagaries of journalism. He was full of enthusiasms, and was always doing the donkey work for some quack. He had a genius for compiling and card indexing. He edited and sub-edited various treatises and anthologies. I remember once that he wrote a book with the impressive title Concentrate, for a South African pseudo-medical gentleman who lived in Westminster and charged 3 guineas a visit for the treatment of concentration. Timothy wrote every word of the book, but when it was published, the author was announced as Mr. Hambro McManus, and this red-haired South African Scot, who arranged his rooms in such a theatrical way in Ashley Gardens, and made mysterious passes and grunts over the back of people's heads, claimed credit for it, and also the royalties. Timothy thought the whole episode extremely amusing. "I never mind paying for experience," he said. "Poor old Mac! He was quite wrong in most of his theories, but somehow I liked him." When I told Timothy about my interview with Mrs. Ray, he was wildly enthusiastic at the idea of my meeting Jimmy Ray when I next went to London. "It's no good going to him as a medical man, or letting him know that his mother sent you. You must just meet him socially. He is just possible on occasions. I could easily work it for you. I could introduce you when you are up in town. You could meet him casually at the Albatross Club or the Café Royal. I should love to know what you think of him." The whole matter passed out of my mind till 5 months later, when I had occasion to visit London for a few days, in connection with the idea of purchasing a half-practice from an old medical friend of mine in West Kensington. Timothy immediately looked me up and reminded me about Ray. His method was characteristic. He came into my bedroom at the little hotel in Paddington and, striking a sentimental attitude, began humming a well-known popular song. When I asked him what his particular ailment was, he laughed and said, "Don't you know the tune?" "I've heard it, I believe." "That's 'The Sheen of Thy Golden Tresses,' the most popular song of the day, words by Francis Valery, music by James Ray. How are the mighty fallen!" I met Ray that same evening at the Albatross Club. Either Timothy's estimate of him was distorted, or he had altered considerably, or else we struck him on a good night. He was quite charming to me. His dress was certainly a little affected, but he was still very good-looking, and he had a quiet sense of fun, and was prepared to listen and be entertained. I observed that he was appreciably more friendly to me than he was to Timothy. He had a curious, high, rather squeaky voice, as though it had never cracked, and a laugh that corresponded. I could understand that this characteristic of him might easily get on one's nerves after a time, but on the whole I could find little to criticize about the man or his behaviour. He even invited me to visit him in his rooms in Chelsea, and there, 2 nights later, I met the great Francis Valery. In looking back after all these years and trying to analyse the character of James Ray, it is impossible to do so without associating it with that of Francis Valery. Their lives and characters dovetailed and reacted upon one another in a bewildering degree. Physically, they were a strange contrast. Valery was a heavy, masterful-looking man with a wide, loose mouth, sloping forehead, and cynical, watchful eyes. He was normally taciturn, unresponsive, and curiously brusque in his manners. By comparison, Ray seemed slim, debonair, almost unsubstantial. I do not think that they really liked each other from the first. On that evening when I saw them together in the Chelsea flat, I could tell by the expression of Valery's face that Ray's high, reedy voice and laughter irritated him. I also came to the conclusion before the evening was over that Valery had a beast of a temper. Once an argumentative young student made a remark contradicting a statement of Valery's, and I saw the latter's eyes blaze with anger and saliva ooze to the corners of his large mouth. He said nothing, however. When we were leaving, the man in the hall handed him his overcoat the wrong way round. Valery snatched it angrily from his grasp and growled. I knew that Ray was also capable of murdering a cat in a fit of passion, so I said to myself that the happy association which produced the sheen of thy golden tresses was not very likely to last. And then comes the strange aspect of the case. The association between Ray and Valery lasted for 27 years, and became a byword amongst English-speaking peoples. In justice to the memory of them both, I would like to hasten to add that they never again did anything quite so bad as the sheen of thy golden tresses. This song was a little difficult to account for. It was in a way their meeting ground, the plank from which they sprang. It was quite understandable Valery writing the words, but quite incomprehensible Ray composing the music. It is not known, and never will be known, by what method or means Valery influenced Ray to suddenly forsake his precious muse and write this appalling song. For a man who up to that time had considered Chopin sentimental tripe, to turn suddenly around and write this ballad, which was devoid of any subtlety or distinction, is one of those things one can only state and leave to the imagination of the reader to account for. Valery had certainly written a good deal of sentimental prose tripe at that time, but nothing quite as bad as that. I think they were both a little ashamed of the song, and never mentioned it. It was nearly a year before anything else sprang from their united efforts, and then was produced the musical play The Oasis. The Oasis was a great success, and ran at the Lyric for over a year. It was an astonishingly clever work, notable for its complete unity. The words appeared to inspire the music. The music was a vivid expression of the words. You could not think of one without the other. If Valerie's libretto appeared ingenious and suggestive of melody, Ray's music had a literary and whimsical flavour of its own which helped the context enormously. It appeared as though from two extreme poles both men had gone halfway to meet the other. Valerie had had little education. He was the son of an unsuccessful bookmaker from Nottingham. Up until that time he had been known as a writer of jingles and sporting articles, but in the Oasis he developed a considerable ingenuity of construction and a really mordant sense of fun. Ray came halfway down from his pinnacle of involved and atmospheric experiment to write simple melodic airs. It was rather amusing to observe in this work, and others that followed, how he cunningly employed some of the lesser-known themes of the despised Schumann and Chopin, adapted them, elaborated them, and converted them into songs of the day. Timothy and I, and some of the others who knew them both, were naturally intrigued to see how the personal side of the association worked. Timothy offered to bet me £5 that they would quarrel and separate within 6 months. It certainly seemed remarkable that they did not. It may have been a fortunate factor that two men working together on these lines do not necessarily work in the same room. Valerie brought Ray the libretto and probably discussed it a little. He was profoundly ignorant of the technical side of music. Ray wrote the music and the lyrics. His partner was clever enough to see that these were good, and there was little for him to criticize. They may have discussed joins and turns and intervals, but there were no great points of cleavage over which they would be likely to fall foul. During the succeeding 5 years, 4 Ray Valerie productions were staged in London and New York, and companies went on the road with them. By that time they had established their reputation as a unique combination. They were beginning to make money and be big people in the theatrical world. And Timothy and I were still awaiting the great quarrel. I had by that time joined my friend Dr. Brill in West Kensington, so that I was able to indulge occasionally in the society of Timothy's friends and to visit the theatre. The Ray Valerie plays were a constant delight to me. I really believe that Timothy was more interested in the men than in their plays. But he was like that. He would come and report to me the latest scandal concerning them, and indeed their behaviour was always open to criticism of some sort. One evening Valerie was arrested for assaulting the head waiter at the Amalfi restaurant because he moved his walking stick from the corner of the room to an umbrella stand. He escaped with a fine and a little gentle bantering from the press. The more successful he became, the more overbearing became his manners. He hardly troubled to speak to anyone, unless it was a pretty woman or someone to whom it paid him to be polite. Upon Ray the effect was almost as disastrous, although it touched him in a different way. His manners in some ways improved. That is to say, he was more sociable and amenable. On the other hand, he became more shallow and insincere, more of a poseur. He adopted the garb of an eccentric genius. He was wildly extravagant, and took parties of girls to the Café Royal and to an ornate bungalow he had hired at Maidenhead. He became less self-opinionated, but it was done as though opinion, no one's opinion, was of any consequence. It was though he had lost something, and the knowledge of it made him desperate. It was a known fact that during those early years of their association, Ray and Valerie sometimes quarrelled, but the quarrel never reached an open rupture. Once Ray appeared in my consulting room. He was looking haggard and ill. When I asked him the trouble, he said, "I'm not sleeping, Parsons." I advised the usual remedies, recommended a complete rest and change, but as I watched the restless movement of his features, I realized how inadequate is the authority of a medical man. We may sometimes make a shrewd guess at the basic cause of a disaster, but no medicine or advice will cure a megalomaniac. Just as he was about to go, he turned to me, and with one of his quick, appealing looks, he gasped, "I hate that man, Valerie." So you see, the old faith in the fetish does not die. What did Ray expect me to do? Possibly he would have been better advised to have gone to a priest. That is, if he could have found a really nice, impressive priest, anyone would have done if they had had only sufficient strength of character to change Ray. I thought of his rather futile old mother, and I felt sorry for him. I said what I could. I tried to persuade him to give up his association with Valerie. I pointed out that his health was more important than his material success. It wasn't that, he tried to explain, not just the material success. He had quite a decent private income, inherited from his father in the accordion-pleated line. Then, what was it? Ray was quite incoherent. He went off late in the evening, and I noticed after he'd gone that he'd left the prescription I had given him on the table in the hall. On discussing the matter afterward with Timothy, I said, "What is it that keeps these men together?" And for all it may be worth, I will quote just what Timothy replied. For Timothy, at that time, had just married a charming girl, a former typist to a dental surgeon in Kilburn, and he was becoming something of a philosopher. This is what Timothy said. "It is the angel of accomplishment, old man. When people are working, doing things together, especially if they are doing them in the face of difficulties, there is always some queer genie which presides over their affections. Comrades in battle, however opposed they may be temperamentally, chaps who row in the same boat, play in the same team at cricket or football, or are up against things together, the angel of accomplishment presides over their fate. It's afterwards, or when they lose that united sense of conflict, that the trouble sometimes comes." In the light of what followed, I found Timothy's remarks interesting. It was during the production of their sixth success, The Apple Pie Bed, that the biggest cloud that had so far gathered over the Ray-Valerie combination made its appearance. And, as one might expect, it came in the form of a woman. Lydia Lou played the part of the ingenue Myra in The Apple Pie Bed. She was a pretty girl, not quite so ingenuous as she appeared on the stage, but in any case too good for either James Ray or Valerie Francis, who were both approaching a rather dilapidated middle age. How their rivalry over the charms of this new discovery never reached a crisis is a mystery to me. I spent a Sunday evening at Ray's flat when all concerned were present, and the look of venom that passed between the two men at the slightest success of either upon the lady's favour was positively frightening. The competition lasted 8 months, and Valerie appeared to be winning. If the matter is really settled, I thought, I shall dread to pick up my newspaper. Let me add that all this time the two men were working on a new play, The Island in Arabia. Timothy said he had seen the figure of Ray, all muffled up, hanging about outside Valerie's house in Knightsbridge late at night, looking like an Apache. The crash was surely about to come, but in July the Gordian knot was severed by Lydia Lou running away with the business manager of a jam and pickle factory. The Island in Arabia was produced the following month and became one of the biggest successes of the series. We all hoped that the episode of Lydia Lou would tend to reconcile the two men, and so apparently it did. But the following year Valerie publicly accused Ray of swindling him. There was a fearful dispute between principals and their lawyers, and the matter came to court. I forget the details of the case, but it principally concerned the royalties on the songs published separately from the score. I know that Ray lost the case, and it cost him thousands of pounds. He went on the continent and married a wealthy Hungarian widow, and we all believed that England had seen the last of him. But as though not to be outdone in this, Valerie also married. His marriage was about as disastrous an affair as ever disgraced the records of a divorce court. It lasted 18 months, and when Mrs. Valerie was eventually persuaded to appeal to the courts, she had a most pitiable story to disclose. Not only had she no difficulty in proving Valerie's guilt of faithlessness, but she recorded a distressing series of cruelties. He had struck her on innumerable occasions. He had thrashed her with a belt, locked her in a cupboard, thrown her out into the garden on a wet night, and many times threatened her with a revolver. A few months after the divorce, news came that Ray's wife had died suddenly under rather mysterious circumstances in Budapest. He returned to London, and 3 years after this law case, Ray and Valerie were again at work together on a play, which was called Wine, Women, and Mrs. Binns. It was one of the most amusing, most lyrical plays seen in London for a decade, and ran for 450 nights. The Ray-Valerie combination then seemed to make a most surprising spurt. They both settled down and worked hard. Ray's experience in Hungary, whatever it had been, quieted him. He became less eccentric, less depraved in his appetites. On the other hand, he was rapidly becoming more self-centred, shrewd, and commercial. He appeared to be obsessed with the idea of making a huge fortune. Valerie was also not without ambitions in this direction, and between them they undoubtedly succeeded in grinding the commercial act to good purpose. There is no question but that the series of plays that they composed during this latter phase were artistically inferior to the earlier ones, but on the other hand their sureness of touch was more apparent. To use a hackneyed phrase, they knew just what the public wanted and how to give it to them. At that time Timothy and I had quite lost touch with them. Timothy was the proud father of 3 girls. He had written several successful novels and stories, and was a reader to an eminent firm of publishers. I myself had a son and a daughter, and in increasing practice. We met frequently and indulged in little social distractions, but we felt no great desire to seek further the companionship of these 2 notorieties. "They're getting a bit too thick," was Timothy's comment after reading the detail of Valerie's divorce. Nevertheless, we still followed their careers with considerable interest, and there often came to us stories of their violent differences, scenes at rehearsals, ugly threats and recriminations. On one occasion, Ray wanted to have the whole of their interests put into the hands of a well-known agent, but Valerie objected. The dispute went on for months, and, as usual, Valery had his way. It is said that they wrote The Girl at Sea when they were not on speaking terms, and the score and libretto were passed backward and forward through a lawyer. Still, they went on from success to success. Together they wrote some 20-odd variably successful plays. In one New Year's Honour list we found the name of James Ray, the eminent composer under the knighthoods. The forces which control the distribution of honours are as mysterious as the forces which control the stars, and rather more inexplicable. How Sir James Ray managed to obtain his title over the heads of many distinguished artists, it is impossible to say. These things are usually accepted with a smile and a shrug, and a man's rivals are not often perturbed by them. But in the case of Valery, the affair reacted disastrously. He was furious. He took the whole thing as a royal affront to himself. If Sir James Ray, why not Sir Francis Valery? It is said that the powers that be have a prejudice against people who have shown up badly in the divorce court. This was true. But, on the other hand, was Ray's private life above reproach? His colleague's title broke Valery up, and it certainly did no good to Ray. They were both now prematurely old men, worn out and embittered. They never wrote another play together. Nestling in a hollow among the gentler slopes of the Pyrenees is a little village called Cambo-les-Bains. No harsh winds ever come to Cambo. Even in the few months of winter the air is soft and tender. In February the hedges are aglow with primroses and violets. In March rhododendrons and magnolias raise their insolent heads. Thither Rostin, the famous French poet, laid out a dreamy garden on the proceeds of the success which was to come to Chanticleer. Alas, poor Chanticleer! Some things survive more readily in a sturdier clime. Thither come people whose lungs are not quite the thing. Just for a month or two, old boy! And they lie there in camp beds, out in the open under the trees, waiting. It is a good place to die. Thither one day came Francis Valery, old and broken in health. He took the ground floor of the Miramar Hotel, with his own valet, cook, and secretary, and thither one day, strangely enough, came Sir James Ray. It seems curious that after a life's enmity they should have been drawn together in the end. It was Valery who invited Ray. It appears to me less remarkable that Valery should have invited Ray than that Ray should have accepted. Valery was completely friendless. The vicious associations of his youth were snapped. People of interest had deserted him. Friends had betrayed him. Ray was not his friend. But in any case they had worked together. They knew each other's frailties. There were 1,000 things they could talk about, discuss. Memories. Perhaps the old inspiration might once more spring forth. Just one more play. It was 7 years now since the curtain had rung down on the Picador. But why did Ray go to Cambo? He had friends of a sort, society people, artists. He was still a figure at dinner parties, first nights. His lungs were still all right. His hatred of Valery was not assuaged. Perhaps he went because he feared him. All through their association he had been under the spell of the stronger party. At every great crisis he knew he had given way. Valerie had him under his thumb from the first. Ray had sworn never to write again, not a phrase, not a bar. And yet one day he took the train from Biarritz and drove up to the little village in the hills. There he stayed for 7 months. For the account of the tragic denouement of this visit, Timothy and I are indebted to an American gentleman named Scobie. Scobie had been to Cambo to visit his sister, who was herself suffering from pulmonary trouble. On his way back through London he had dined at Timothy's one evening at Chelsea, and I was the only other guest. Mr. Scobie was a lean-faced New Englander, with small, keen, grey eyes beneath shaggy brows. He had long, thin hands, the first fingers of which he had the habit of shaking at us alternately as he spoke. He was not anxious to talk about the Ray-Valerie affair. He said he would rather forget all about it. But as Timothy had inveigled him there with the express purpose of pumping him in the matter, we were cruel enough to insist. Mr. Scobie had certainly had enough of it. He had had to give evidence in a French court through an interpreter, and he had no great opinion either of French courts, their dilatory methods, or their sanitary arrangements. You see, he was the sole witness of the actual tragedy. It appeared that his sister's suite of rooms was in the Hotel Miramar Annex. From her balcony he had a complete view of the south veranda, where Valerie spent most of the day. He had spoken to Valerie once or twice, but finding that he was a bear with a sore neck, he desisted and devoted his attention to other hotel guests. Then he explained, "The other boy with the squeaky voice turned up." "Sir James Ray?" "Sure. I didn't take much stock of him at first. I used to hear him piping away below, and the other occasionally barking back an answer which I couldn't hear. But at last that voice began to get on my nerves. You see, I could hear just what he said, but I couldn't hear the reply. It was like listening to a man on the phone. My, it was a voice! I was almost on the point of wanting to call out to him to quit. But you know how it is. If you listen to anyone, you kind of can't help wanting to hear what they are going to say next." "What sort of thing did he talk about?" "Most every kind of dither, like old men will. The colour of a girl's frock in some show put across when he was a young man, the best place to buy overshoes, the retail price of whisky. He was a pretty good hand at whisky, too. He arrived with 2 cases. The other man sat watching him. I didn't like them. I tried to get my sister moved, but the hotel was full. I was away in Paris during the fall and didn't return for some months. I got back to Cambo 3 days before the thing happened." "I don't think Mrs. Timothy took the interest in this incident that we did. In any case, she made some excuse about packing up Christmas presents for the children and left the room." Mr. Scobie, Timothy, and I drew up our chairs around the fire. "How did you find things when you got back, Mr. Scobie?" "Identically the same, sir. There were these 2 old boys still on the veranda below, sitting some way apart, squeaky voice with the whisky bottle in front of him, letting on about the difference between Merino and Linsey-Woolsey, or the rise in home rails, or the name of a girl who used to sell programmes at some god-forsaken theatre. There was the other man, kind of vague in the background, growling, 'Yes,' or 'No,' or 'Damned if he knew or cared.' It was November, and the weather was heavy and overcast for those parts. It's a dandy place, except for the sick people." "What happened on the actual day?" It all grew out of the same thing, if you'll believe me. It was early in the afternoon. I'd been out for a stroll. When I got to my sister's room, I heard squeaky voice going strong. The other man was asking him where some place was hard by. Yes, sir, I recollect exactly now how the thing came through. Squeaky voice said, "You remember the villa next to Madame Poncel's épicerie establishment? There's a flower pot in the window about the size of a stone ginger beer bottle. Well, it's just opposite." This seemed to satisfy the big man, except that he growled, "Oh, it's there, is it?" Then he added, rather savagely, "I know the place you mean. I noticed the flower pot myself, but it's a good 3 times the size of a stone ginger beer bottle." Then, believe me, the trouble began. It beats me why the argument got them like that. Squeaky voice began to scream that he had taken particular note of the flower pot at the time, and he'd swear it wasn't an inch higher than an ordinary stone ginger beer bottle. And each time the bear got angrier and growled, "It's 3 times the size." The argument raged for an hour. Squeaky voice pointed out that the other was every kind of wall-eyed, bone-headed thruster, and the bear rolled about the veranda, shaking his fist and using language that would have made a Milwaukee bartender hand in his checks. The exhibition tired me, and I went in. I think they slackened up too after a bit. Somewhere away in the big rooms a meal was cooked. The night came on quick, and the moon broke through the clouds. And after dinner I'm darned if I didn't hear them going it again, hammer and tongs. "I'm a judge of size," Squeaky was saying. "There isn't an inch to it." "It's damn nearly 4 times the size," roared the other, who, you see, had raised his figures. I was near to getting the hotel management on to quelling the disturbance, but it slackened off. At least I thought it had. At about 10 o'clock I went to my room, which was right at the corner. I went on to the balcony to take a last breather, and then I saw the whole darn thing happen. "Have a little whisky, Mr. Scobie," said Timothy. "I will, sir, thank you." It seemed dead still. I thought they had gone in, but suddenly I saw Ray. That's the man's name, sure, Ray. He was crouching in the corner of the veranda just beneath me, and he had a bottle in his hand. I thought at first it was a last carouse. Then, by the light of the moon, I noticed he was holding it by the neck, and the bottle was empty. His thin voice came up to me like a husky wail. "Blast you! It is just the exact size!" I could just see the shadowy form of the other man lying back near the window at the end. He was mumbling, 5 times as big. Ray went toward him like a cat. I called out, and I think the effect of my cry was to get the big man alert to trouble. He was on his legs by the time Ray reached him. I saw the bottle swing in the air. Then they came to grips. Gosh, I've seen men fight, but tables and chairs and glasses were scattered and broken. I heard the bottle break, but one of them was still holding it by the neck. Up and down the veranda they rolled and fought and bit just like madmen. Then there was a scream. A man and a woman rushed out. I went below. The big man, Valerie, was lying in a heap, dead, his throat cut from ear to ear. Ray was writhing by his side. He died the next morning. He died blaspheming. Like a gump, I gave out that I'd seen the whole thing, and they nailed me for the inquest. These French courts serve justice, Huck. I wanted to forget the whole blamed thing, wipe it out of my memory, but there I was nailed, made to go over it and over it again. I never thought it possible to see such scarlet hate and passion. Just savage beasts they were, and all over the size of a flower-pot. Thank you, Mr. Alice, just a little finger. The fire glowed in the warm security of the little room, and snow was drifting against the windows. In the drawing-room across the passage, Mrs. Timothy was running her hands over the keys of her piano. Timothy smiled wistfully. "Neither Ray nor Valerie ever liked me," he remarked, apparently irreverently. Then, by way of explanation, "I'm going to have my revenge upon them. It isn't often that a writer of fiction has things like that left at his door." Mr. Scobie nodded and shook his long first finger at him. "I see your point, sir. Provided you leave me out, the goods are yours. Here's another small side issue that might be useful to you. It wasn't a flower pot at all. I verified the fact next day. It was a child's red stockingette cap. Just think of it. They only had to stroll 10 minutes up the village street. They could have taken a ruler, bet each other drinks, laughed the whole thing off. Instead of that, they thought it more amusing to fight with broken whiskey bottles. What do you think of it?" We sat there, staring at the fire. Timothy was sucking at an empty pipe. "I can see the explanation," he said at last. "I should be entertained to hear it, sir." "You see," said Timothy slowly, "the angel of accomplishment had deserted them." End of The Angel of Accomplishment.